Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming back after lunch. Thank you all for inviting me to come give a talk. As you've probably seen in these other talks, Louisiana is a pretty special place when it comes to birds. Of the 480 species roughly that have been seen in the state of Louisiana, 450 of those have been recorded in the coastal parishes. Since most of my talk will deal with coastal nesting birds, particularly water birds, it's important for you to know how many species we get. On any given year, we typically average about 26 to 27 species of colonial nesting water birds. Some of the species that may not occur every year would be things like sooty tern. Chandelure gulls may not be captured every year in our surveys. Common terns may not be seen in our surveys, but probably do nest here every year. One other thing to point out, most of the numbers you're going to see were calculated based on the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries Wildlife Diversity Program data. So these are surveys that were done typically via helicopter or via fixed wing, like a small Cessna. I'm not going to read the numbers off, but one thing I wanted to point out is the abundance of nesting birds is pretty great in Louisiana, some of the greatest in the country. Louisiana ranks #1 for many species as far as our responsibility when you look at that species over their range in the US or even globally, and I'll show that on the next slide. The other thing I wanted to point out, so these are the pairs of these nesting species, okay? So for example, with laughing gulls, you would multiply that by 2 to get the number of nesting birds, okay? Brown pelican, we think if you include things like non-breeders, so pelicans take typically 3 years or so to reach a level that they're gonna breed or nest. If you include those in that number, the number of pelicans in Louisiana would be something closer to 80 to 100,000 within our borders. As far as responsibility goes, and it kind of depends on whether you look at subspecies versus species as a whole, but globally, it is pretty safe to say that on the low end of some of these more common species, we're looking at about a 25% of that species occurs in Louisiana compared to the rest of its global range. If you look at this more closely and only compare the nesting bird numbers in Louisiana versus the rest of the northern Gulf of Mexico, species like brown pelican go from 23% to about 50% of the entire population of nesting eastern brown pelicans in the northern Gulf of Mexico occurring in Louisiana. So obviously Louisiana is critically important for brown pelican. If we look at things like sandwich tern, that number goes up to about 80%. So 80% of the sandwich terns in the Gulf of Mexico likely nest in Louisiana. Kelp gull, just for fun, that's a species of gull. It's a hybrid species between chandelure gull is a hybrid between kelp gull and herring gull. We've known about that pairing of birds in the Chandelure Islands for maybe 20 years, roughly. On our last survey, where we were actually able to observe them, that was a couple of years ago, and we had probably a dozen pairs, at least, of Chandelure gulls. So that was kind of neat. Maybe it could be a speciation, occurring, real time. You may actually be able to follow this along. The Deepwater Horizon event that occurred in 2010, when the rig blew up, it killed 11 people and injured 17. That leak at the wellhead occurred for over 80 days. It was more or less capped in mid-July. And by the time it was done, at least 3 million barrels of oil had leaked out into the Gulf of Mexico, and 130 million gallons is what that would translate to. It would have filled more than 200 Olympic-sized swimming pools, and more than 850 miles of Louisiana's coastline was oiled or impacted by that oil. One of the things I really had to think about in putting this talk together is I have trouble trying to wrap some of these bigger numbers around in my head. And to me, Olympic-sized swimming pools are just really big swimming pools. So, so what I did is I looked up how much the average household in Baton Rouge uses in water each month, all right? If you extrapolate that out over the year, that house, if the water they had consumed, that house would have to use water, so this oil in this case, for over 1,200 years to match the amount of oil that was put out in the Gulf of Mexico. So as far as the bird estimates, or the estimates of birds that were killed by this spill, on the higher end, at least the published information that we can defend, it's over 100,000 birds. Now, we do know as scientists that that number is almost certainly much lower than what it probably actually is. Okay, so, and this is not to criticize what was done during the spill, because we understand, defendable versus, what makes sense to us, maybe biologically. But the fact of the matter is there were areas of our coast we could not access during the spill. So those could have been things like interior marsh. We know birds, when they are injured or they're sick, a lot of those species, maybe even all of them, seek little hidden spots or nooks that we may not ever find them. So there's a detection issue. There's an accessibility of interior marsh issue. We certainly did not walk on bird colonies during nesting because we knew we would end up killing probably more birds than certainly than would have been acceptable in order to save a few that may have been oiled on the colonies. In addition to that, the calculations included a little bit of the foregone reproduction. So it really included 2010. So if an adult bird died in 2010, you can calculate how many fledglings that species should have had if their nest had been successful, and you can come up with a number. You can come up with a calculation. The same thing was done in 2011, so it was pulled through the next breeding season. However, seabirds in particular are very long-lived birds. We have records of sooty terns living 60 years or something like that. And we have albatross. One single albatross we know about that was banded as a chick on its nest. And she's almost 70 years old, still produces chicks. So birds don't senesce like humans and like other animals. So by taking that out of the calculation, we potentially not included potentially exponentially more birds than could have been added, in other words. If we look at the mortality, so this is a word cloud of the birds that occurred in at least a 3% or greater amount of the mortality during the Deepwater Horizon spill. To translate this, laughing gulls were about a third of the birds that were killed during the spill, a little bit more than a third. Pelicans were a little bit more than a quarter. And these are all important, well, except some of these birds are not breeding birds in Louisiana. But certainly Louisiana and the Gulf Coast provide very critical habitat for these species throughout their life cycle. In all, 93 bird species were documented as being injured by the Deepwater Horizon spill. The dots in purple or pink are colonies that the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries Wildlife Diversity Program has in their database for colonial nesting water bird colonies. Gray that you see there is the maximum extent of the oil from Deepwater Horizon. The green is where the rig had been. About 100 colonies, roughly, occurred within that edge where the oil hit the shore. It doesn't take a rocket scientist or maybe even a biologist to realize that in order to recoup these birds, you got to restore their habitat. It's a pretty straightforward thing. You got to restore the habitat for things that nest here, like brown pelicans, or things that loaf here and spend. Things like white pelicans, which were also certainly impacted, greater than 3% based on the last image I showed you. And birds like this, these are Forster's terns. They nest usually on wrack that washes up in marsh. And obviously the stuff that washes up in marsh washes up because of water. The water also carried the oil, so those birds also got hit. Something like 70% of the Forster's terns within the Gulf of Mexico nest in Louisiana. So again, it's a pretty significant number. We also had birds, sharing similar habitats with the oil, like red knot, which is now considered a threatened species by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. You know, we can do various things to restore. I show one example on this slide. This is a rack. So this is beach raking to remove rack, because rack is not attractive to sunbathers. And that being said, this is a critical, I think Jessica even mentioned it, it's a pretty important habitat for birds for roosting, feeding, et cetera. So just stopping that would be one good path forward. So $5 billion was set aside in Louisiana, or was given to Louisiana by the responsible parties for restoration. So these little pink squares are the projects that were approved by the NERDA trustees. So some of that $5 billion could be used for some of those projects. We're going to go through some of these. These projects range from things like an oyster hatchery to barrier island rebuilding. 347 million in early restoration are these green squares. 22 million additional was allocated after the settlement, so post-settlement. And those are these little pink squares. And we're going to go into some of these more closely. I will say, and I'll talk about it, this is Breton. So that was early restoration. That hasn't really, they haven't broken ground yet on the construction. But otherwise, most of these other projects that are green are completed. You'd also find, if you dive deeper into the $5 billion, 148 million was dedicated to bird recovery in Louisiana, or bird restoration in Louisiana. If you look at that compared to the other states across the Gulf of Mexico, those total about 115 million total. So Louisiana has a much larger piece of the pie, as we should, since we were the most impacted. All right, so the places where little birds have now popped up, these are going to would have overlaid those squares that I showed earlier. Incidentally, those squares I showed earlier are also major bird colonies. In fact, some of the biggest bird colonies in the state. So restoration has either occurred or will be occurring in these orange areas. Green, I think, is up in the air, but I think it's also a gigantic bird colony. Those islands are really important to terns and egrets and other herons, and also pelicans. So I'm going to go through some of the earlier restoration stuff first, and then we'll work our way into the kind of the future restoration projects. So Last Island was an island basically composed of all of these islands put together, plus some probably. It was a destination spot prior to a horrible hurricane in the mid 1800s, killed 200 to 400 people. They had a hotel on the island. People were brought out there on steamships. It was a pretty significant kind of happening vacation place back in the time. It's now obviously significantly smaller than it was, and it's a refuge that Wildlife and Fisheries now maintains and manages. On average, it's pretty safe to say that it supports at least 20,000 nesting pairs of birds, brown pelicans, terns, as well as egrets, ibis, etc. So I've added a scale to all of these Google Earth images to try to help you. Again, scale is kind of an issue for me in my head, so I figured I would add these so you can kind of have somewhat of an idea of what we're talking about as far as how big these islands are. So you might see these little bit green dots. Those are supposed to be football fields. Whiskey Island has had quite a bit of restoration over the last decade or two, I guess. The most significant one occurred during early restoration, at which time back barrier marsh was created, and there was also sand to re-nourish beaches. If you look at this image, this is a really great image from CPRA. These areas that are white sand, those who go to the beach would recognize, I'm sure, that's drier sand. And things like terns and black skimmers can key in on that, and really within a year after restoration, they're nesting on it. So we can get kind of immediate results pretty quickly, at least for a little while. There's some islands in the southern Barataria Basin, west side of the river. Shenirong Keel, which is, I think it's really more of a headland, I guess. And then Shell Island. And again, you can see from these images how white the beaches are. They're really great for terns and skimmers. And in fact, when an earlier restoration occurred back in 2013 on Shell Island. So now actually Shell Island extends quite a bit further. It's not cut off here because it was restored in 2017 or completed in 2017. The next year I did an aerial survey of that island. It might be really hard to see, but this is this amoeba shaped thing here. Those are all birds. So we're talking thousands upon thousands of nesting terns. Terns like sandwich terns and royal terns kind of interspersed within. In general, I went back and I looked at how often these islands were used, and really in the past decade or so, before they were restored, there wasn't a whole lot happening on these islands. But in the last 5 years or so, 6,500 pairs of birds at least, and sometimes quite a bit more. Like, this is probably over 10,000 pairs, which is kind of hard to imagine. But when you bring it into a computer and you start counting, you can get much better numbers. All right. So again, Breton has been approved, and it's probably going to start work, I guess, hopefully in August of this year. One thing I should have pointed out, the $72 million, these are pretty big price tags, right? So some of those earlier ones I showed you were like 125, 130 million. So when you look at it really in the grand scheme of things, $140 million for bird restoration, you kind of have to draw from other pots, and you can, because it makes sense, because you can restore beaches for turtles and that sort of thing. So, but yeah, in the whole grand scheme of things, it's really not that much money. You can do some pretty big projects, 1 year, maybe 2 years, 3 years out. And then things kind of dry up as far as, money for big restoration. Breton is a giant colony for birds. These little bitty, so the kind of dark green, those are actually mangroves, but the lighter dots within that are all pelicans. So several hundred pelicans just within this little area. And then again, this amoeboid shape, these are all royal terns and sandwich terns. So again, several thousand pairs of nesting birds. So as far as post-settlement dollars, we have really two major bird colonies I'm going to talk about. One is Queen Bess Island, which is north of Grand Isle in Barataria Bay. I don't want to say it was the poster child during the oil spill, but a lot of stuff happened at Queen Bess. A lot of oil birds. One of the first birds that we knew about that was oiled in the spill, we had gotten word that there were chicks, pelican chicks in nests that were this really rich brown instead of being white. And I don't know if anybody knew what the scale was going to be until a few weeks after that. But I'll never forget that image. Right now, right now the island really only supports about 5 acres of nesting. And that's because this island, which is about 36 acres, it's ringed with rocks, which is good because it pretty much maintains the footprint, at least in this part of the world. However, you can see this island is kind of in 3 different cells. So 1, 2, 3. This middle part used to be really popular with the pelicans as well as the wading birds. But over the years, subsidence has really sunk that middle of the island. So whereas you used to be able to have birds nest here, now there's very little nesting in that area. It's mostly mangroves always sitting in water, pretty much. So the idea would be to dump sand across the entire island and build it up 1.5 to 5 feet, so we can get a slope on the island, different types of vegetation for different types of birds. The idea also, in particular, is so this area right here would be filled with limestone and maintained so it's vegetation free. So terns can use it and black skimmers can use it. The rest of it would be for pelicans. So 29 acres would be for pelicans and waders, and about 7 for terns and skimmers. And finally, the last island that I'm going to talk about is Rabbit Island. And this island is in the southern part of Calcasieu Lake. It's our westernmost pelican island. In fact, it's the closest pelican island to that is over here in the Old Deniers called Raccoon Island. So that's obviously a pretty significant distance. So it's valuable for that, but it's also valuable because it's a breeding site for things like tricolored herons and in particular this reddish egret that you see on the slide. It's a critically imperiled species. It's probably the rarest heron in the New World, so it's critically imperiled. We don't know when this is going to start, but one thing I really do want to point out before I step out of here is this is the elevation of the island in various parts. So these are elevations, the rings. The mean high water mark is about a foot. Well, the island is about a foot in elevation. So whenever there's high water, at this point, almost the entire island floods, which obviously is not ideal for things that are trying to nest in the vegetation. This is a photo I took during an aerial survey in 2013. And these are pelicans, the kind of white circle areas, those are pelicans sitting on nests. And so more than likely everything failed, at least in that part of the island. And then finally, this is Wine Island, which is just east of Trinity East Island in the Ildeneers. In its heyday, it had about 30,000 nesting pairs. That was back in the 90s. It's I think now it's probably either completely submerged or almost completely submerged underwater. And you can see these pelicans are sitting in what looks like rafts of their nest, right? So these things presumably did not succeed that year. But the thing is, we have the know-how really to try to fix things, I guess. And at this point, we have a pretty decent budget, to get us some places in restoration. So hopefully we can avoid things like Wine Island in the future. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.